This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 60 of the 1001 Movies podcast, based on the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. This week we'll be talking about Bob Fosse's 1972 musical, Cabaret.
Look, why don't you just come out with it? You can't stand Maximilian because he's everything that you're not. He doesn't have to give English lessons for 3 marks an hour. He's rich, and he knows about life. He doesn't read about it in books. He's suave, and he's divinely sexy. And he really appreciates a woman.
Screw Maximilian.
I do.
So do I. Beautiful.
To really understand some of the themes and issues behind the story that is Cabaret, it's interesting to look at the story's origins. In 1939, English novelist Christopher Isherwood published his first successful book, a collection of novellas entitled Goodbye to Berlin. It included a story entitled Sally Bowles, in which the author retells of his friendship to the title character, an Englishwoman who sports green nail polish and an unabashed lack of talent singing at the local nightclub. Isherwood, who was gay, left out any romantic subplots between himself, that is, the narrator, and Sally. In the story, Sally would have an affair with a wealthy American businessman and would subsequently have an abortion. Goodbye to Berlin also included stories about a young Jewish heiress in Berlin named Natalia Landauer, as well as a gay couple named Peter and Otto. All of these stories were rather taboo or political for the time that they were published. The book was popular, and it was adapted into a stage play called I Am a Camera in 1951 by playwright John Van Druten. He kept Sally in the story, but unlike Isherwood's novella, she has an affair with Christopher, the narrator of the novella. Van Druten also brought Natalia Landauer, the Jewish heiress, into the plot. Fritz, with whom she has an affair, also appeared in Isherwood's work, although the two never crossed paths in the written stories. The play was relatively successful, and actress Julie Harris won a Tony for her portrayal of Sally Bowles. The title, incidentally, came from the first line of Isherwood's novella, which reads, I am a camera with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking. The irony is that in the play, Christopher becomes a participant in the plot, while on the original story, he's mostly an observer. 4 years later, I Am a Camera was made into a film directed by Henry Cornelius and starring Julie Harris, Lawrence Harvey, and Shelley Winters. The story was recreated yet again as a stage musical in 1966 as Cabaret. Although Sally remained a constant, many other character changes were made. For instance, English Christopher became American Cliff, and the romance between Natalia and Fritz became a romance between the landlady Fraulein Schneider and a Jewish tenant. Most importantly, perhaps, the stage musical introduced audiences to the mysterious master of ceremonies, a kind of Greek chorus who comments on the action throughout via several musical numbers. At one point, the MC was played by Joel Grey on the stage, and more on him later. Cabaret was a hit on Broadway, and Allied artists invested, or I think perhaps gambled is a better word, $1.5 million to buy the rights to make the musical into a film. Producer Cy Feuer lobbied heavily for Bob Fosse to direct the film. The two had worked together twice previously. Now, this was ill-advised, because although Fosse had made a name for himself on Broadway, his 1969 film Sweet Charity, based on the stage hit he directed and choreographed, bombed dismally, and things did not look well at all for Fosse's future in pictures. To understand why the producers chose Fosse, one may have to understand the state of musical films in the early 1970s. Musicals were never more popular than in the 50s, when life was seemingly more innocent. But their popularity plummeted in the 1960s, making the way for more epic adventures in film. The producers initially had someone like Joseph L. Mankiewicz in mind to direct, but it became clear that they needed to combine some of the dark subject matter of the previous versions of the story with some of the charm of the 1950s musicals. Perhaps this, or perhaps it was a result of the necessity of a cheaper filmmaker, was why they eventually hired Bob Fosse. After the producers saw Liza Minnelli sing on stage in Paris, she became a shoo-in to play Sally Bowles. Ironically, they wanted a Michael York type to play Brian, who is formerly known as Christopher and later as Cliff in the previous stories. When York himself heard about this, he offered himself up for the part, and of course he was hired. Screenwriter Jay Allen made the romance between Natalia Landauer and Fritz a subplot, while Fraulein Schneider, the landlady, simply made a few appearances with hardly any subplot at all. The Master of Ceremonies was carried over from the musical stage play, and Joel Grey was cast as him almost by default. Cabaret the film was, of course, an amalgamation of the Isherwood stories and the plays that were based on it. Englishman Brian travels to Berlin in 1931, moves into a boarding house, and meets his neighbor from across the hall, American Sally Bowles, who spends her nights singing in the Kit Kat Club and entertaining wealthy businessmen. Sally introduces Brian to Fritz, who falls in love with Natalia, and she also introduces him to Maximilian, resulting in the most tangled love triangle ever. Both Brian and Max, we find out later, are bisexual. How this resolves I will not reveal, but since this is Berlin in the 1930s, we know that any Jews, English nationals, or Americans will probably not live out the rest of their lives there happily ever after. Of course, Cabaret was a smashing success, both critically and at the box office, and it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It had one huge competitor at this ceremony, however, Francis Ford Coppola's epic The Godfather. Liza Minnelli and Joel Grey, who had been nominated for Best Actress and Best Supporting Actor, assumed they would lose. Al Pacino's supporting role as Michael Corleone was a particular favorite, and Bob Fosse had also assumed defeat to Coppola. Nobody was more surprised when Cabaret won 8 of its 10 nominations, including Best Direction for Fosse, Actress for Minnelli, Supporting Actor for Grey, Art Direction, Cinematography, Film Editing, Adapted Musical Score, and Sound. At the time, it was customary for the Academy to give Best Picture to the same film made by the Best Director. So one could imagine how Cabaret's producers' spirits fell minutes after Bob Fosse won his statuette, and it was announced that Best Picture went to The Godfather, which also won Best Adapted Screenplay over Cabaret. Bob Fosse would continue making musicals, but only for a very short time before his sudden death in 1987. His darkest and most autobiographical film was 1979's All That Jazz, which is the subject of another episode. The leading cast, although they went on to make many more films, seemed to peak with Cabaret. Liza Minnelli appeared in New York, New York, and Arthur before fading into near obscurity, battling with an addiction to drugs and alcohol, and then appearing in the 1980s to raise money for AIDS research. Michael York had a prolific career both on stage and in front of the camera. Joel Grey continued to make hit appearances on the stage and originated the role of the Wizard of Oz in Wicked. If you're a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, by the way, you may know him as the role of Doc in the Season 5 episode of the same name. What did I think of Cabaret? One of the things I really like about this film is its realism as a musical. The characters don't belt out musical numbers in the midst of conversations like they do in traditional musicals. The singing is relegated mostly to the Master of Ceremonies on stage at the Kit Kat Club. While these performances don't add to the plot, they serve as a commentary of it, or, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of Greek chorus. I went into this movie looking forward to the plot, of which I knew nothing, and already despairing over a lot of dreary musical numbers, and I was pleasantly surprised to really enjoy the music in this film. Joel Grey's much-deserved Oscar-winning performance steals each and every scene, even in ones in which he's one of a dozen characters on stage. I couldn't even take my eyes off of him. There is one scene in which Grey serenades a gorilla dressed like a woman while singing "If You Could See Her Through My Eyes," which seems silly and comical at first, but ends on such a tragic note that it quickly becomes one of the few moments in the picture which instantly roots the audience in the reality of the time and place in which the story is set. And then there's the story. Watching it in 2017, I feel like it should be called Cabaret, with apologies to Christopher Isherwood. Michael York's Brian, who is an adaptation of Isherwood himself, doesn't just befriend Sally, but falls in love with her, even though he initially tells her he only sleeps with boys. While I understand that this is a result of the film being a product of Hollywood in the 1970s, it kind of complicates things when he sleeps with Max, who is also sleeping with Sally. Are all of these infidelities really necessary? Why can't Brian be the camera as originally described in Isherwood's story, a character who observes rather than participates? And to support that argument, I present Exhibit A, Peter MacNicol's character in Sophie's Choice. The story does not transfer well to modern day, which is unfortunate because otherwise the film is as fresh as the day it was made. That brings me to the unbelievable direction and choreography of Bob Fosse, who I wish could have lived to make more musicals, although 2002 Chicago was intentionally made with Fosse's style in mind. I've already sung the praises of the musical numbers, but Fosse's talents don't end there. The film is directed and edited in an unusual way, presenting occurrences outside of the lives of the main characters in strange but not awkward tableaus and montages. There's the nightclub manager being brutally attacked by Nazis after throwing one of them out of the club. A morbid scene of a dead Jew on the road is seen from inside a car, not to mention the implications made in the finale. And I'm not going to explain that one for you, just urge you to see it. The only musical number which is not choreographed is at a large picnic attended by Brian and Max. A cherubic boy begins a beautiful rendition of Tomorrow Belongs to Me, and the camera slowly pans down to show that he's wearing a Nazi armband. Moments later, almost all the picnic-goers, save for Brian and Max, join in on the song. It's a haunting scene, and Fosse expertly uses the camera in place of snappy dancing numbers. That brings me to Liza Minnelli. Now, I fully realize that she has enjoyed a successful career, and she has a great voice, and she can dance, but I don't think she can act. Minnelli flits about the screen with a doe-eyed, look at me, I'm so cute attitude that obviously appealed to many people, but which I frankly find annoying. I've only seen her in one other film that I can remember, 1981's Arthur, and I found her only a little less cringeworthy in that. This is one of the reasons I can't buy, or maybe even resent, the relationship between Brian and Sally. Simply put, the two of them have no chemistry. Brian meets Sally as a shy English boy and seems to be the same way throughout the film. The Sally character, as well as the story itself, would have benefited tremendously if she and Brian remained platonic. All that being said, one critic wrote that Cabaret is a musical for people who hate musicals. And if you hate musicals, then by all means give it a try. Just put aside some of your modern-day political correctness, and you may even end up enjoying it more than I did. That's all I had to say about Cabaret. Tune in next week when I talk about the 1978 Cheech and Chong comedy Up in Smoke. Meanwhile, you can email me any questions or comments at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc, and look for the podcast's Facebook page. Until next time, happy viewing.